Do you know what this is? It tells me that someone in my family enjoyed painting. It's a palette, the board one uses to mix paints to get just the right shade. We've had a great many famous painters in our country, and there was one painter who became better known for his inventions. That person was Robert Fulton. He played a very important part in the history of our country because he invented the steamboat. Now, why was that important? Well, after men like Daniel Boone and Lewis and Clark opened up the unlived-in parts of our country, people began spreading out in all directions, settling new towns and villages. But traveling from one part of our country to another was still dangerous and difficult. Oh, the roads were bad, full of ruts. Stagecoaches sometimes toppled over on them. The big Conestoga wagons sometimes got stuck in the mud. Flatboats and rafts could be used to carry meat and corn or furs on the rivers, but they could only float downstream with the current, not up. Now, all that changed after August 17th, 1807. That's the day that a crowd of people gathered on the shores of the Hudson River in New York. They were all looking at a strange boat tied to the dock. It had masts like a sailboat, but it also had a funny-looking engine on its deck, and fastened to its sides were paddle wheels. Many of the people laughed at Robert Fulton's steamboat. They thought it would surely sink. But when it puffed and chugged away from the dock, you can be sure there were cheers and shouts. Here was a boat that could go upriver almost as quickly as it could go down. And soon, steamboats were seen not only on the Hudson River, but on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers as well. Let's learn more about Robert Fulton. What was he like as a boy? Well, I told you that he had been a painter as well as an inventor, and he began painting pictures when he was just about your age. But he could not go to the store and buy a box of paints. He had to make his own, from berries or ground-up clay or whatever he could find that would make colors. I'd like to tell you what I think is kind of a funny story about Bob Fulton's first paintbrush. Bob sat on a milking stool. He was trying to draw a picture of a neighbor's fields. Oh, some of it looked very well done in pen stroke, but the sky looked all wrong. How could he get it right when he had no brush? He set his paper down and sighed. Just then, the cat, Matilda, sprang on Bob's shoulder. Her long tail swept across his face.
Why, how very soft it feels.
Bob had a new light in his eyes as he stroked Matilda's fur. He whispered,
Nice, Matilda. You wouldn't miss a few hairs, would you? You see, Matilda, I need a soft brush.
Matilda looked at Bob suspiciously.
Oh, I stand willing to pay for the brush. I will give you the top of Bessie's cream. And I will give you my helpings of fish. Maybe even a chicken liver now and again, and anything else I know you like.
With great excitement, Bob went to work. He noticed that the tip of Matilda's tail made a perfect paintbrush, so he cut the hairs with great care. He wanted them to form the same little point for his brush. He wanted to copy Matilda's tail as nearly as he could.
There, Matilda. That didn't hurt, did it?
Oh, for answer, Matilda streaked to the door. Now, Bob plucked a long hair from his own head. He wound it tightly around the little bundle of cat hairs. Then he glued the bundle in his goose quill. He dipped his new brush into his jug of blue paint and painted a cloudless blue sky in his picture. All during supper, Matilda rubbed against his leg as if to remind Bob of their secret agreement. Bob kept his word. His hand carried food below the table almost as often as it carried it above. In less than a week, Bob needed more brushes, slender ones, fat ones, medium-sized ones. Matilda grew to be a most peculiar-looking cat. She became plump as a pumpkin, but oh, her fur, it was as patchy as a ragbag. I think our cats can be very happy today that we buy our paintbrushes at a store. As a young man, Bob Fulton became a very successful painter in the city of Philadelphia. Why, Ben Franklin even asked him to paint his picture. But let's get back to the mind that invented the steamboat. I think the ideas for that might have begun on a fishing trip that Bob took as a young boy. He went with a neighbor gentleman named Dieter Gumpf and his son, Chris. There were no oars to Dieter Gumpf's boat. Instead, there was a long pole with a spike on the end of it. Mr. Gumpf handed the pole to Bob.
It comes your turn first. Upstream a little ways is a fine fishing ground. Always the fish are hungry there. Now we see how quick Bob can pole.
Bob dug the pole into the bed of the creek and pushed hard. The water rippled away on both sides of the boat. Oh, at first the hard exercise was fun. By the time he reached the fishing spot, however, all the fun was gone. Bob was so tired he felt almost faint. Slowly he reached for his bucket of bait. He baited his hook. Slowly he cast his line into the water. Dieter Gumpf lighted his clay pipe and settled back to wait for the first nibble. Chris chewed on a piece of grass and waited for a fish to bite. Bob felt himself falling asleep. Suddenly, Dieter Gumpf was shaking him.
Pull in your line. We move. I know a better spot. Now it comes Chris's turn to pole the boat.
Pa, I'd sooner climb a tree heels upward. Can't we stay here?
Dieter Gumpf glared at his son. Chris argued no further. Slowly the boat began to move. They passed tidy Pennsylvania farms. They passed wooded hills with wild cherry trees in bloom. Finally, Dieter Gumpf exclaimed,
Here it is we catch the fish. Whole strings of fish.
Chris's face was scarlet. He slapped at a mosquito on his forehead. Dieter Gumpf shouted,
Don't make so much noise. You boys are as jumpy as corn tassels. How you expect the fish to bite?
Soon Dieter Gumpf's face grew red too. Oh, but not from exercise. Angrily he said,
The people have built too many dams. They are killing the fish. Bob, we move upstream farther. Again it comes your turn to pole. Stand up, square your feet, push.
Bob dug the pole into the river bottom. It took all his strength to push the boat out into the middle of the stream. Away from the shade of the trees, the sun blazed. It pricked Bob's skin. It made the water glare like a mirror in the sun. In only a few minutes, Bob was drenched in sweat. It ran down his face and dripped from his chin. The mosquitoes and flies were biting fiercely. They left great lumps on Bob's bare arms. To make matters even worse, there was the choking smell of Dieter Gumpf's pipe. It made Bob feel queer in his stomach. Dieter Gumpf exploded.
What a snail's pace. Push, boy.
Bob's arms ached. He wished the pole would break in two. He wished he were a horse with a good long tail for switching flies. He even wished he were in school. Bob turned to Mr. Gumpf.
Mother sent some fresh rhubarb pie for you, and there's a jug of cider, too.
Dieter Gumpf took his pipe out of his mouth.
Your mother is a fine woman, Bob. A fine woman. When I spy a nice shady spot, then we can eat.
Chris spoke up.
Pa, I see a good place. It has a rack with picture writing done by the Indians. We could use the rack for a table. It's in the shade, too.
Bob sent a look of thanks to Chris.
Boys think only of stuffing their stomachs. All right, we eat. We share our lunches.
The rock with the Indian writing did make a fine table, but Bob couldn't eat. He was too tired. Dieter Gumpf, however, had a fine appetite, and he liked the looks of Bob's lunch better than his own. He went through the food greedily. When Bob's head stopped pounding, he turned to Mr. Gumpf.
There must be an easier way to move a boat than by poling it, sir.
Mr. Gumpf's stomach was full. He felt good.
Yeah, William Henry thought so, too. he tried to find a way.
You mean William Henry the gunsmith on Mill Creek?
Yeah, he had ideas, too. Once he built himself a boat what ran with steam.
Bob forgot he was tired. He sat up straight.
A boat moved by steam? Did it work, sir?
Our kid made 2-3 trips. Then comes a storm. The boat sinks. Kerplunk. Like a rock she sinks.
Bob sharpened a stick with his jackknife. Eagerly, he handed it to Mr. Gumpf.
Here, Mr. Gumpf. Please draw a picture of how the boat worked.
Mr. Gumpf threw the stick into the water.
It didn't work, I tell you. Anyone knows that boats have to be poled. Some people are always trying to get out of work. Now leave me alone. I come to fish, not to think about moving boats without poling them.
Bob, however, could think of nothing else. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of Robert Fulton's steamboat. The stories we heard today came from this book, Bob Fulton, Boy Craftsman, by Marguerite Henry. Well, steamboats certainly became a very good way to travel on rivers. But how could one get to the farmers and other settlers who lived away from the rivers? Do I hear music? Well, I think we must have a musical ghost in this attic. And I know that song. Do you? Yes, it's the Erie Canal. We have a ghost who answered my question. Canals were built so people could travel by water, even though they didn't live near a river. Flat-bottom boats were pulled along the canals by horses or mules. It was a slow way to travel, but a safe and a comfortable way. I hope you'll travel back to my attic again soon. Will you? Good. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. If your family
should decide to move to a different home, chances are moving men with a big truck would come and take most of your furniture for you. Then you and the rest of your family would get in the car and have a comfortable drive to your new address. Your move would be very easy compared to what it might have been back in the 1840s and 1850s. At that time, many Americans wanted to move to the far west of our country. They wanted to start new homes in Oregon, California, New Mexico. The trip could take as long as 6 months. I mean, that's half a year. Most of the pioneers going west traveled in covered wagons pulled by oxen. Everything they thought they would need had to be piled onto or packed into the wagon. Tools, bedding, furniture, clothing, food that wouldn't spoil. Their farm animals would follow along behind. The pioneers did not try to make the trip west alone. It was too dangerous. They joined together with other families in what was known as a wagon train. Each wagon train had a leader and usually a guide, someone who'd gone over the westward trail before. Our story today is about a family traveling the trail to Oregon. Mrs. Van Antwerp is taking her daughter Charlotte and her son Bert to meet their father. He had gone on ahead with another older son to try to find a place for the family to settle. Bert's most precious possession on the trip was a gold watch of his father's. I think it must have looked a lot like this old one that I found up in the attic. Charlotte's most precious possession was her cat Moses. He was little and black with white paws. He had one blue eye and one green, and Moses was a mischief maker. Because of his mischief, he nearly lost his life several times on the trip. That's why our book is called 9 Lives of Moses on the Oregon Trail. One night, when the pioneers were bedded down in their wagon train camp on the prairie, Charlotte was wakened by the weight of Moses, tense and heavy on her middle. He was growling at something out in the blackness. Charlotte got up and peered out into the dark. Nothing moved in the camp. No wolves howled. But suddenly Charlotte heard the frightening sound that had awakened Moses. It was a low, steady roar that filled her ears and shook the earth beneath her. She didn't know what the sound was, but she was certain it was full of danger. She must wake someone. Stumbling over the ground, she came upon the first sleeper, their guide, Mr. Smithers. He was rolled in a blanket before the ashes of a fire. Charlotte shook him.
Mr. Smithers, wake up! Listen!
He was on his feet in an instant. The roar could mean only one thing. He fired his rifle into the air, calling,
"A stampede! Buffalo! A whole herd coming right our way!"
The men of the camp jumped from wagons or threw aside blankets. Guns in their hands, they ran toward Mr. Smithers. Mr. Smithers ordered,
"Children, stay in the wagons. Ladies, build a row of fires fast as you can, right to the south of the wagons. Boys, inside the circle with our animals. Men, come with me."
The roar in the dark grew louder. It seemed as if the circle of 16 wagons was about to be taken over by the terrible noise. Then there came 6 rifle shots from out in the darkness. Oh, they were tiny sounds against the roar of the stampeding, bellowing buffalo herd. And yet, there was a change, a pause in the pounding hooves. Something out there had made the buffalo stop for a few seconds. When the stampede began again, the herd had split into 2 parts, one part passing to the left of the camp, the other to the right. By daylight, the last of the buffalo had disappeared. As the women stirred up the fires for breakfast, the men returned dusty and red-eyed. They carried buffalo meat and the hides of 6 buffalo. Everyone crowded around to find out what had happened. The leader of the wagon train said,
Let Smithers tell you. It was his miracle.
No miracle on my part. Only thing to do is check 'em in their rush, or it's goodbye to whatever's in their path. We checked 'em by shooting their leaders. The dead critters in their path and the fires burning round the wagons made 'em stop just long enough to split 'em into two groups and leave us safe in the middle. What does beat me, though, is what a narrow escape we had. If we'd have been 5 minutes later in waking up, we couldn't have stopped 'em in time. It's thanks to little Miss Charlotte here that we're all alive to tell the tale. How come you heard 'em coming and the rest of us sleeping on?
Everyone stared at Charlotte.
I didn't hear them either. It was Moses. He woke me, and then I knew it wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get you or someone quick.
Mr. Smithers shook his head and scratched his whiskers. Then he said,
Well, now, it does seem as if that mischievous little black feller has some use to him after all.
Moses is not so helpful in our next story. One day, Charlotte was exploring around a river when she heard the angry cry of an Indian, mingled with the hissing and spitting of a cat. She rushed to the sound. Except for the anger on the face of the Indian and in his voice, Charlotte would have laughed. The angry chief was handsomely dressed in clothes that members of the wagon train had traded to him for fish. A tall black silk hat, a vest, and a cutaway coat. The chief wore these and nothing else but his breechcloth. Standing at the water's edge, the Indian held the spitting cat in one hand and his fish-skinning knife in the other. His little girl was holding a partly eaten fish, obviously Moses's work. As the chief was about to plunge the knife into Moses's throat, Charlotte ran forward and snatched the cat from his hands.
No, no, you can't kill him.
The Indian turned an angry look on Charlotte. She bravely stood her ground. Just then, Mr. Smithers came running up, followed by Charlotte's pale, anxious mother and her brother Bert. Mr. Smithers spoke to the chief in his own language, and the man grew calmer. But the Indian replied in a long and forceful speech of his own. Shaking his head, Mr. Smithers turned to Charlotte.
He says, Missy, that your cat's a thief and ought to be punished.
Tell the chief, tell His Majesty, tell him I don't think Moses was being a thief. He was just being a cat.
The guide told the Indian what she had said. The chief looked at Charlotte. The anger left his eyes, and after a moment he laughed and spoke again. Mr. Smithers told Charlotte,
The chief says you're a right smart young'un, but he reminds you that in being just a cat, Moses stole and spoiled his fish.
I know it. Please tell His Majesty that I'm sorry.
She waited anxiously while Mr. Smithers and the chief talked. Finally, Mr. Smithers turned to her.
You've really rubbed his fur the right way with this Your Majesty business, Missy. But he says the fish was his best catch and he was fixing to make a feast for his little daughter.
I'll try to pay.
Just then, the little Indian girl dropped the fish and ran to look at Moses. She said something to her father, and he bent to examine Moses. Then he talked in an excited manner to Mr. Smithers.
He says, Missy, that your cat must have magic in him with them odd eyes. So if you'll give the cat to him, he'll forgive the stealing.
Charlotte thought her heart would break. Moses lost to an Indian? Oh, she knew she must not cry. She stepped forward, holding out the cat to the Indian as she spoke.
Tell him I think the magic in Moses turned bad and makes him scratch and bite. But if he wants to risk it, I suppose he has a right to take him.
True to his mistress's words, Moses lashed out with his claws when thrust near the Indian. The Indian jumped back. He looked at Charlotte with admiration. He spoke then at great length to Mr. Smithers. Mr. Smithers turned pale.
He says, Miss Charlotte, that you're the wisest female he has ever known. He says that you have even greater magic than your cat. And so he'll take you in exchange for the damage your cat has done.
Charlotte's mother gave an angry murmur. Mr. Smithers warned,
Guard your feelings. He dotes on that little girl of his, and he gives her the best of every catch. Her mother's been dead a long time now, and he thinks Miss Charlotte will make the best stepmother in creation for his little girl.
Charlotte's mother began to weep. Just then Bert stepped forward. He took his father's watch from a pocket. He opened the gold watch and studied its face.
Tell His Majesty that her magic has gone sour like the cat's has. Go on, tell him.
The chief listened to Mr. Smithers with interest, watching Bert and the gold watch gleaming in his hand. Bert went on.
Tell him, in case he doesn't know, that a female whose magic has gone sour is even worse than a cat whose magic has gone sour.
Bert, how dare you?
Charlotte ran to her brother and shook his arm hard. His only answer was,
Tell him he can see what I mean.
The Indian looked at Charlotte with less admiration now.
Now tell him that he looks mighty handsome in those nice clothes. But tell him one thing is missing, a nice gold watch to fit into the pocket in his vest.
Bert stood dangling the watch by the chain while Mr. Smithers spoke and pointed out the empty watch pocket.
Tell him he can take Charlotte in payment for the fish. I agree he deserves payment. But tell him if he doesn't want to risk a female gone sour, I'll buy her back, paying him the watch.
Mr. Smithers spoke to the Indian, who reached out for the watch. Bert showed the chief how to open and close the watch, how to wind it, and how to use it as a compass. Bert and the Indian and Mr. Smithers shook hands. Then Bert took Charlotte by one arm, his mother by one arm, and with knees shaking, the three walked back to their wagon. The stories we heard came from 9 Lives of Moses on the Oregon Trail by Marion Archer. Angry Indians and buffalo stampedes were just 2 of the dangers faced by the pioneers traveling the trail to Oregon. Wagons overturned. Sometimes people were swept away in the rivers they tried to cross. There was much hunger and sickness. But aren't we lucky that there were people who would try to make that trip west? They settled new lands that truly stretched our country from one ocean to the other. I hope that you will be coming back very soon for another story about America's past. I'll look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.
Hi. As I was looking through this box of old books, I got to thinking about the fact that there are several different kinds of books. One kind of book tells us about true things that have really happened. In others, the stories could only be make-believe. And then there's still another kind when one can't be quite sure whether the story is true or made up. I wonder which kind of book you will think Gretchen and the White Steed is. Let's share it and find out. Gretchen called to the old gray mare.
Hurry, hurry!
Her 10 brothers and sisters called too. They were in the back of a wagon pulled by oxen. They were going west with their mother and father to make a new home in Texas. The wagon was the last in a long wagon train. Behind their wagon walked the old gray mare. 2 big sacks of cornmeal were tied on her back. Often the old mare wandered away from the trail to eat grass. Then the children would have to call her. With so many children, the wagon was crowded. Besides, it was packed with all kinds of things. There were pots and pans, beds and chairs, boxes and barrels. The wagon was noisy. The wheels creaked and squeaked. Pots and pans clinked and clanked. And the children made noise, too. They laughed and they shouted. They sang songs and they played games. After dinner at night, sitting around the campfire, the children were quiet. They liked this time best of all. They would listen to their father as he told them stories. One night, he told them a story about the famous White Steed. Oh, everyone in Texas had heard of this beautiful wild horse. He was all white with a cream-colored mane and tail. After the story, Gretchen said,
"It would be fun to ride the White Steed."
Her father laughed.
You can be sure that no one will ever ride him. He runs so fast that the Indians have named him the White Ghost. Few people have even seen him.
If I can't ride him, could I ride the old gray mare?
You can ride the mare tomorrow. She's slow and gentle, and if you aren't in a wagon, it might be a little less noisy.
The next morning, Gretchen's father lifted her onto the back of the old gray mare. He tied her on with strong ropes so she couldn't fall off. As the wagon went rolling across the prairie, the old gray mare walked slowly behind it. Gretchen leaned back against the cornmeal sacks. She smiled happily. Why, it was just like sitting in a rocking chair. Under the hot sun, she began to feel sleepy. Her head nodded, her eyes closed. Soon she was fast asleep. It wasn't long after Gretchen fell asleep that one of the wagon wheels hit a bump in the trail. The wheel broke, the wagon tipped. Gretchen's father leaped down from the driver's seat and with the help of some of the other men, he began to fix the wheel. Gretchen's mother was busy taking care of the children, but they all had so much to do, they did not see the old gray mare wander off. She was hungry. Farther and farther she went, looking for nice green grass to eat. It was a long time before Gretchen woke up. When she did, she sat up straight. She looked around. All she could see was rolling land covered with green grass. Gretchen knew that the gray mare had taken her far from the wagon trail. She knew, too, that she was alone on the prairie. Where was the wagon train now? Would she ever see her family again? She said to the mare,
"Won't you take me back? We are lost out here on the prairie."
But the old gray mare didn't seem to mind being lost. She just went on eating. Gretchen wondered what to do. Suddenly, Gretchen heard hoofbeats. Out of the bushes galloped another horse. It was a big white horse with a cream-colored mane and tail.
"Oh, it must be the White Steed."
Rearing up on his hind legs, the White Steed neighed. Then he turned and started to gallop off. The old mare neighed and galloped after him. Holding on to the mare's mane, Gretchen cried,
Stop! Stop! Please stop!
but the old mare kept right on galloping after the white steed. Gretchen tried to untie the rope so that she could slide off, but she couldn't get the knots undone. All she could do was hold tight to the mare. Soon they came to a grassy valley. The white steed stopped and neighed loudly. A large herd of wild horses came rushing toward them. They ran up to the old mare and touched her with their noses. It was their way of saying hello. One of the horses sniffed at a sack of cornmeal. A bit of the meal had come through the sack. The horse tasted it. He seemed to like the taste. Then he nipped the sack to get some more. The other horses smelled the cornmeal. They crowded closer to Gretchen and the old mare, and they too nipped at the sacks. By mistake, they nipped Gretchen's legs too. Oh, they didn't mean to harm her. They were only trying to get more of the cornmeal. But their teeth were sharp and their nips hurt. Gretchen cried out,
Go away! Please, go away! You're hurting my legs.
Gretchen waved her arms and shouted at the horses. They just kept snorting and nipping as they ate all the cornmeal. The white steed was nearby eating grass. Now he looked at Gretchen. He ran toward the wild horses and chased them off. Then the white steed started to chew at the rope around Gretchen. Oh, at first Gretchen was frightened. But then she saw that he was trying to help her. He kept chewing until he had bitten all the way through the rope and Gretchen was free. Then, with his teeth, the white steed took a firm hold of the collar of her dress. He lifted Gretchen down from the back of the old gray mare. Gretchen looked at her legs. They were covered with red marks where the horses had nipped her. She began to cry.
My legs hurt. I'm thirsty. I'm tired. And I'm lost. How'll I ever find the wagon?
The old mare was happily eating grass. She did not come when Gretchen called. But the white steed seemed to listen. He started to walk away slowly, and he kept looking back at Gretchen as if to tell her to follow him. She did, and he led her to a water hole. Gretchen washed her face and her hands. She splashed water on her legs. She drank, too, scooping water with her hands. It was now late in the day. Darkness was spreading over the prairie. Gretchen yawned. She was so tired. Crawling into the tall grass, she fixed herself a place to sleep. She lay down, closed her eyes, and soon she was sound asleep. When she awoke, the sun was high in the sky.
Oh, I've slept too long. I must try to find my way back to the wagon.
First, Gretchen went back to the water hole, and there, standing beside it, was the old gray mare. Gretchen was so happy to see the horse. She patted her mane.
You'll take me to my family, won't you, old gray mare?
Gretchen tried to get up on the back of the old mare, but she was too short. Then she saw a big log lying on the ground. She thought if she could get up on the log, she might be able to get onto the mare's back. But she couldn't get the mare to walk to the log. She pushed at the mare's legs. She yelled at the mare. But it was no use. The mare would not budge. Suddenly, Gretchen was afraid again.
What will I do now? No one will ever find me here.
Tears came to her eyes. She leaned against the old mare and cried. Then she heard hoofbeats coming up behind her, and before she could turn around, she felt something pulling at the collar of her dress. It was the white steed. Gently, he lifted Gretchen and put her on the mare's back. Then, with a toss of his head, the white steed galloped off. The old gray mare galloped after him. Gretchen held tightly to the mare's mane, and on they went. Where was the steed taking her? At last, on a little hill, the white steed stopped, and there, not very far away, was the wagon train. Gretchen could see her wagon and her mother and father and her brothers and sisters. Oh, the mare leaped forward and galloped toward the wagons, and Gretchen shouted,
"Mother, Father, I'm back! I'm back!"
Gretchen's mother and father came running, and so did her brothers and sisters. Gretchen's father swung her off the old mare's back. He held her tight in his arms.
The other men and I have been trying to find you. We've searched and searched, but the prairie's such a big place. We were just getting ready to go out and look for you again.
The white steed saved me. He's over there, on the hill. Look!
But the white steed had already turned and was galloping off in the distance. All they could see of him was a flash of white in the sunlight.
Oh, why is he running away? I wanted to thank him.
He always runs from people. He wants to be wild and free.
Then Gretchen's mother spoke up.
Look at your legs. They're covered with red marks. My poor little girl, what happened to you?
Gretchen told them how the horses had nipped her, trying to get to the cornmeal.
Tell us everything that happened since you left. Begin at the beginning.
And Gretchen did. And when she'd finished her story, the wagon train went on. Again, she rode with her brothers and sisters. Again, the old mare followed slowly behind. Gretchen's legs soon healed, but she would always have the little scars where the horses had nipped her. When the long journey was over, the people of the wagon train made new homes for themselves in Texas. A little town sprang up, and as the years passed, the town grew. Gretchen grew too. Oh, she got married and had children of her own and then grandchildren. She liked to tell them the story of the white steed. Sometimes a grandchild would ask if the story were true, and then Gretchen would show the little scars on her legs. When her grandchildren grew up, they told the story to their children. And so it is that the story of a wild horse and a little girl has never been forgotten. And that was Gretchen and the White Steed by Erwin Shapiro. Well, what do you think? Was it a true story? We know that a great many pioneer families did cross the prairies in their covered wagons. Was Gretchen among them? I wonder what you will decide. See you again soon. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.
Hi. Can you guess what these rusty pans have been used for? They have been used for finding gold. Isn't that exciting? Yes, gold hunters would shovel dirt or sand into pans such as these. Then they would dip water into them and twirl the pans. As they twirled, the sand and dirt would fly out, leaving the heavier flakes or pieces of gold clinging to the rusty sides and bottom. Well, that is, if the fellow looking for gold were lucky. Many times there would be nothing left in the bottom of the pan. Well, that was just one of the ways that men looked for gold during the days of the California Gold Rush. At that time, California had not yet become a state. The land known as California had first been explored and settled by the Spanish. Later, it belonged to Mexico. Then, in the year 1847, Mexico sold the land to the United States. So, when gold was discovered in 1848, the land belonged to the United States. But there were not enough people living in California for it to become a state. Let's visit California in the year 1848, and let's meet a boy by the name of Carlos Rivera. Young Carlos Rivera crouched in the blacksmith shop and pumped the bellows up and down, up and down. Sparks from the fire went flying up the chimney to scatter in the California night. When the tire rim for the ox cart was hot from the fire, Ramira, a Mexican worker, helped Carlos lift the rim to the anvil. Then Ramira shaped it with blows of the hammer. While the rim cooled, Carlos stared off into the dark night. It was January 1848, and on a nearby fence hung 6 cowhides. They were the last of what had been the family's herd of cows. By the barn, 2 skinny oxen picked at the small pile of dry straw that lay before them. Carlos looked at them a moment, and then he looked at the ox cart. In a few weeks, they would drive the cart to San Francisco. To himself, Carlos muttered,
"There ought to be some way to stay here. Something I could do to keep us from having to leave the ranch."
5 years before, when Carlos was only 9, his father, Antonio Rivera, had brought the family here to live on the banks of the Sacramento River. He had worked very hard to raise wheat, but his first 2 crops of wheat failed. Then the 3rd crop had been a good one. And one night, as Antonio was coming home with the money from the sale of his wheat, a bandit met him on the road and demanded the money. Now, Antonio had worked hard for that money. He needed it for winter food and to plant a new crop in the spring. He clutched the money to him. He tried to raise his gun, but he was too slow. The bandit shot Antonio dead, stole the money, and rode away. Well, after that, young though he was, Carlos had become the head of the family. He had tried to make a success of the ranch, but for 2 years now there had been little rain. The crops had died, the cattle had starved, and now the little family would have to leave the ranch and go to San Francisco. There, Mamacita, Carlos's mother, would run a bakery. Carlos felt angry.
"It's not fair. If only I had water for my fields like Captain Sutter, I could raise wheat."
Just then, his thoughts were interrupted by a girl's voice calling his name. It was Carlotta, Carlos's twin sister. Screamer, a tame talking crow, perched on her shoulder. Carlos asked,
"What do you want?"
"I came to tell you something exciting."
Carlos looked out the doorway to where Captain Sutter's fort stood in the moonlight. Around it lay green gardens, fed by the water from canals that Sutter's Indian workers had made for him. These canals could carry only enough water for Captain Sutter's own crops. Carlos knew this, and for that reason he'd never asked the captain for any water from them. But now he thought perhaps Captain Sutter, who was a good and generous man, had offered to help him.
"You mean the captain sent you to tell me that he's going to let me use water from his ditch?"
"No, not that. I came to take you to the fort."
"I'm busy."
Do come. There's a man there, and the man's got something shiny tied in a bag. It's mysterious.
In spite of himself, Carlos found he was interested.
Please, Carlos, please. It's strange, and I want you to see it.
Oh, all right.
Carlos followed Carlotta across the fields to the fort. They stopped near a lighted slit in the adobe wall. Carlotta motioned for Carlos to bend down. Carlos saw two men in the room. Between them on the table lay a cloth, and in it some dust and shiny pebbles. Carlos turned to Carlotta and whispered,
It's Captain Sutter, and James Marshall is carpenter. Mr. Marshall went up the American River to build a sawmill for Sutter.
They could hear Mr. Marshall talking to Sutter.
I found this stuff by the mill I built for you. Captain, it's gold. Gold. Right up there on the American River.
Carlotta couldn't believe her ears. Excitedly, she whispered,
Gold. Oh, Carlos. If we found gold, we could buy shoes and dresses. A new gingham dress with buttons all down the front for Mamacita. And you could build ditches for your land and raise hay enough for the cows and oxen. Just think. Real gold. Tomorrow we must go to the American River and find it.
You're a girl. You can't go digging for gold.
I can. I will, and you will, too. Now, come on. Let's go tell Mamacita about it now, and in the morning we'll go.
Carlos shook his head and followed his sister. Well, the news got out that gold had been found in California. And during the following year, thousands of men went to California to look for gold. Because the year was 1849, these men were called 49ers. Some of them headed for California, traveling by horseback or wagon train across the prairies. Others made the long trip by boat, going all the way around the tip of South America and then heading north to California. Still others took a somewhat shorter route, going by boat to Panama. Oh, but there they had to cross swamps filled with crocodiles. Those who made it traveled once again by boat to the village of San Francisco. Why, some men even came from as far away as France and Germany and China. Carlos Rivera met a young man from Massachusetts named John Stayer. John had come all the way from New England in the hopes of striking it rich. He and Carlos decided to hunt for gold together. One morning, many months after they'd started their search, Carlos woke up very discouraged. He and John had yet to find any gold. But he got up and went down to the little stream beside which they were camped. John followed Carlos, and Screamer the Crow flew after both young men, calling out, "Gold! It's murder!" John and Carlos tried pan after pan of the sand and found no gold. Screamer flew to peck at a rocky ledge across the stream. "It's gold! It's gold!" he called out. Carlos raised his eyes and sighed.
If it only were.
Then suddenly Carlos blinked his eyes, for before him seemed to lie a ledge of pure white rock through which wove a solid streak of dark metal. Gold! Carlos gripped his pan until his hands grew white. But then the day grew lighter, and the ledge of rock became just the dull granite of the Sierra Mountains. Suddenly, a sort of rage made Carlos turn to John.
You know, we've been following in someone else's footsteps all along, following the other miners.
Carlos pointed north.
There's no tracks there. Let's try it that way.
John agreed, and they began to pack their things on the mule. In half an hour, they were on their way. They walked all that day and the next and the next. On the evening of the third day, they camped beside a little stream. Carlos took a water can and went down to the edge of the stream to get water for coffee. Across from him lay a ledge that looked like the one he had seen the morning they started out. Screamer flew to it and pecked along the rock, calling, "It's gold! It's gold! It's gold!"
You don't fool me a second time.
The reflection of the rocky ledge lay in the water. For a moment, Carlos stared. He brushed his eyes with his hand and stared again. He dipped his hand into the pool to make ripples. But when they smoothed out, the golden ledge was still there. Then Carlos dared to raise his eyes. What he saw sent his blood leaping through his veins.
Gold!
But Carlos still wouldn't believe what he saw.
It's only the sun on ordinary rock.
But the sun went down, and the gold still lay there. He couldn't help but yell.
Hey! Hey, John, take a look at this!
John came running. He could hardly believe his eyes. It was gold. Quickly, the boys moved their things to be down near the gold and make camp there. Then they would wait for morning. For 5 months, Carlos and John mined their gold claim. Then, one day, Carlos said,
"We'll have to sell our mine soon. The surface gold is all but mined out, unless you want to buy machinery and work the mine yourself."
John looked at Carlos and shook his head. John was ready to go back to Massachusetts and buy a farm. Carlos looked off toward the plains. He realized that he, too, was content. He and Carlotta and Mamacita had been through all the joy and sorrow and madness of the search for gold. But now he could go home, home to the ranch where they would be able to stay. What you heard today was just a small part of the book We Were There with the California 49ers by Stephen Holt. During the gold rush, life was rough and tough in California. There was much shooting and robbing and killing. Oh, and it was very expensive. Why, eggs were $6 a dozen. But within 10 years, the gold rush was pretty much over. Many of the gold seekers returned to their homes. Still others stayed on in California and tried their hands at farming. In time, California became a very good place indeed in which to live. I'm sure those of you who know California will agree with that. We still have a lot to learn about our country, so you come back again soon. All right? I'll see you then. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.
Hi. This faded old piece of red material may look like nothing more than a rag to you. But at one time, it was worn like a scarf by a very important person, a Pony Express rider. Today, along with a boy named Dick, we're going to find out about the Pony Express. It was late October in 1860. A train moved slowly through the Missouri woods. Dick turned to the man sitting next to him.
Are we nearly to St. Joe?
The man looked at Dick.
Yes. Aren't you pretty young to be riding on the train by yourself?
I'll soon be 11.
What's that tag around your neck?
My Aunt Jane put it there. She was afraid I might get lost.
The man read the tag. It said, "My name is Dick Park. I am on my way from New York to meet my father in St. Joseph, Missouri. Please help me get on the right trains."
You didn't come all the way from New York by yourself.
Yes, I did.
Well, I never heard of such a thing. They tied a tag on you and sent you out here like a sack of corn.
Dick didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the train window. Now he could see a town. Yea, he had finally reached St. Joe. The people on the train began picking up their bags and their boxes. Dick picked up his carpet bag. It was nearly as big as he was. The train stopped. When Dick got off, he looked everywhere for his father. But his father was not there. After a pretty worrisome time, Dick did find a man who had known his father. The man's name was Sam. Sam asked,
"Did your father know you were coming?"
My Aunt Jane sent him a letter. She sent it 2 weeks ago.
If she sent it to St. Joe, he didn't get it. He left here a month ago. Your father is riding with the Pony Express.
The Pony Express?
Don't you know what the Pony Express is?
Is it a train that carries mail?
It carries the mail, but it isn't a train. Tell you what, I'll show you what the Pony Express is.
Sam led the way to a corner where a crowd was standing. Someone shouted, "Here comes the Pony Express!" A horse and rider came in sight. They came down the street as fast as the wind. The crowd gave a cheer. The man waved his hat as he went by. He rode on down the street to the river. There, he rode right onto a ferry boat. The boat took the horse and rider to the other side of the river. Sam turned to Dick.
That was a Pony Express rider. He just crossed the Missouri River, and now he's in Kansas. Did you see how he carries the mail?
No.
There's a piece of leather with a pocket in each corner. It fits over the saddle, and the mail goes in the pockets. Most of the letters and papers go all the way to California.
Why don't they go on the train?
The trains don't run any farther west than St. Joe. The Pony Express takes the mail from here. Those horses and riders keep on, day and night.
Doesn't it take a long time to get the mail to California?
Most of the time it gets there in 10 days. Sometimes it takes only 8 or 9 days.
Are you a Pony Express rider?
No, the Pony Express doesn't want big men. That makes too much for the horses to carry. Your father isn't a very big man, and he's one of the best riders in the country. That's why the Pony Express is glad to have him.
But where is he? When is he coming back to St. Joe?
Maybe not for a long time. He went to ride in Nebraska.
That's a long way off, isn't it?
Yes, a pretty long way.
Sam decided that Dick could get to Nebraska by stagecoach. So early the next morning, Sam put Dick on a stagecoach going west. 4 horses were hitched to the coach. The driver sat on a high seat outside. When he cracked his whip, they started off down the street. During part of the trip, Dick rode outside with the driver. And while the coach rolled along, the driver told him stories, and he told him about the Pony Express.
The coach carries the mail, too. It carries the slow mail. Pony Express takes the fast mail.
Are we in the Pony Express trail now?
Yep. There are way stations all along this road. See that house with the log barn? Well, that's a way station. Riders stop there to change horses.
Just then, Dick heard the sound of a horse's hoofs. A horse and rider came toward them. The rider had a red handkerchief around his neck.
It's a Pony Express rider. I can see the mail pockets on his saddle.
He's taking the California mail back to St. Joe.
After many days, the stagecoach finally reached the prairies of Nebraska. The land was flat and bare. Oh, and the day was rainy. The stagecoach driver told Dick,
"We'll get to your father's station today."
At last, Dick saw a sign that read Owl Creek Station. He saw a log cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney. The coach stopped. The driver handed down Dick's carpet bag from the top of the coach. Then he cracked the whip and waved goodbye. Dick ran through the rain to the log cabin. He knocked on the door. A woman opened the door.
Who are you? Where did you come from?
A man came out of the next room.
Father!
Dick? I can't believe it. Dick, how did you get here?
I came by the stagecoach.
But son, why didn't you let me know?
Aunt Jane sent you a letter. She sent it to St. Joe, and you weren't there.
You didn't come from New York by yourself.
Yes, I did.
What did Aunt Jane mean by sending you out here all alone?
She said it was time I came out west to live with you.
Mr. Park looked at Dick.
I ride for the Pony Express. You know that, don't you, son? I don't have a real home. I don't know whether I can keep you here at the way station or not.
Just then a shout went up outside.
I've got to go. The mail has to be on time. Mrs. Kelly, please take care of my son for me. Dick, we'll have a long talk when I get back.
Mr. Park threw on his raincoat and ran out the door. Dick went to the window. Out in the road were two horses. One looked tired and its legs were muddy. The other was shaking its head and kicking up its heels. Mrs. Kelly said,
Look, Dick, see them putting the mail on the fresh horse? It never takes them over 2 minutes to change. There goes your father up into the saddle. Look at him ride.
When will my father come back?
Not for 3 days.
Dick looked out into the rain. Aunt Jane had sent him all the way from New York because she didn't want him. Now it looked as if his father didn't want him either. When Dick's father returned in 3 days, he had a long talk with the Kellys, who ran the way station. And the Kellys said that Dick could stay with them if he would help care for the ponies. Oh, but Dick told his father,
I don't want to stay here.
Why not?
I don't like the prairie. It's flat and ugly and cold, and the wolves and coyotes howl at night.
It isn't bad when you get used to it.
I don't want to get used to it. I don't want to stay.
Now that you're here, there's nothing else for you to do.
Do you remember what you told me before you came out west?
Yes, I remember. I said I was going to make a home for us where we could be together all the time. And we are going to have a home someday. But now I have my work here. That comes first.
Why does it come first?
Our country is in trouble. Soon the North and South may be at war. I think of our Pony Express as a chain to hold the east and west of our country together. Every way station, every rider, everyone who helps is a part of the chain. Don't you want to be a part of it too?
Not if I have to stay here.
Sometimes we all have to do things we don't want to do. You're old enough to know that, Dick.
And, of course, Dick did have to stay. One evening, several months later, Dick was all alone at Owl Creek Station. The Kellys had gone into town. When Dick's father came galloping up with the mail, Dick could see that something was wrong. His father told him that he had been shot in the arm by horse thieves. Dick said,
I'll help you to a bed.
But the mail?
I'll carry the mail.
No. It's a long way. You've never been over the trail. Something might happen to you.
But when Mr. Park tried to get on a fresh horse, he found he was too weak.
Dick, I'm going to have to let you go. It's the only way.
Dick helped his father inside, and then off he rode. The moon was bright. He could see the trail a long way ahead. While he rode, he thought of many things. He thought of what his father had said about the Pony Express being a chain reaching across the country and holding it together. For the first time, Dick felt that he was a part of that chain. He was carrying the mail. Dick looked back toward Owl Creek Station. He saw a shadow moving along the trail. The next time Dick looked, There were more shadows. They looked like big dogs moving together. Oh, all at once Dick knew. The shadows were wolves. He felt cold and his mouth was dry. He'd never liked to hear the wolves howl at night. Now he was riding with a pack of them at his heels. He held tight to the saddle. His hand touched a leather pocket. What? He felt something hard inside. His father's pistol. He pulled it out. He turned in the saddle and pointed the pistol at the nearest wolf. He fired. The wolf jumped high into the air and fell. The other wolves sprang upon it. Dick heard them howling and fighting. Dick rode on as quickly as he could. A cloud came over the moon. The night grew dark. It was hard for Dick to see the trail. Then something moved ahead of him. It was a horse and rider. The man called out,
Hello, is that you, Tom Park?
Who are you?
I'm Frank Martin from Sand Hill Station. The Pony Express is late. I'm looking for the rider.
I'm the rider.
You?
Yes, I'm Dick Park. Some men shot my father, and I had to bring the mail.
Come with me, quick.
Side by side, the two rode up the trail. They came to the log house that was Sand Hill Station. There, another rider was waiting to take the mail on. When Dick finally got back to Owl Creek Station, his father was a very happy man, happy that his son had returned safely. He was happy, too, to learn that Dick no longer wanted to leave Nebraska. He wanted to stay and be a part of the Pony Express. What you heard today was just a small portion of the book Riding the Pony Express by Clyde Robert Bulla. In a few years, the Pony Express was no longer needed. As soon as tracks could be laid, trains took the mail from one part of our country to another. And of course today, we depend on airplanes to take the fast mail. But back in the days when there were no airplanes and few trains, believe me, our country truly needed the Pony Express. I hope you've enjoyed our story about it today. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.
I have a question. Can a person be owned by someone the way a cow or a horse is owned? I'm sure you don't think so, but people who used to have slaves thought so. Like a cow or a horse, a slave had to work for the person who owned him. And like a cow or a horse, a slave could be sold. We don't have slaves in this country now, but at one time there was a lot of slavery. Most of the slaves were black and worked in the South on big farms called plantations. The farms in the northern part of our country were small, and the farmers did not need extra help. Most of the northern states made laws against owning slaves. The blacks who lived in the north were free. Even in the South there were free blacks. Some slaves were freed by their masters. Others ran away to be free. Our story today is about a slave who ran away. The story of Harriet Tubman. Harriet could not fall asleep. Underneath the blanket, the dirt floor was hard. Oh, but she was used to that. Her brothers were talking, but she was used to that, too. It was their words that were keeping her awake. Terrible, scary words.
They say the master has no more money.
That's why so many of our people are gone. He sells the slaves to get money, or he sends them away to work for other plantation owners.
Who will be next? One of us?
Shush! You'll scare the little ones.
Harriet whispered in the dark.
Please, Lord, don't let the master send my brothers and sisters away. Please, Lord.
The next day, the air was warm, the sun was golden. Oh, it was too nice a day to worry. But Harriet thought of the words she had heard in the dark. Who will be next? One of us? That same morning, a woman, Miss Susan, came to see the plantation master.
I want a gal to take care of my baby. I can only pay you a few pennies a week for her.
I have just the gal for you. She's only 7, but she can do the job.
Miss Susan's wagon took Harriet farther and farther away from the plantation. Harriet wondered how her family would feel when they learned that she had been sent away. There had been no time to say goodbye. Harriet found out right away what work she had to do. Miss Susan told her to dust and sweep. Harriet knew how to sweep. Oh, she'd often swept the dirt floor of her own cabin. But she did not know how to dust. She'd never learned, for there was no fine furniture in a slave's cabin. Miss Susan whipped Harriet for not knowing the right way to dust. Every day, Harriet cleaned the house and ran errands. Every night, Harriet rocked the baby. Harriet had to make sure that the baby did not wake up and cry. The baby slept in a cradle near Miss Susan's bed. Above the bed was a shelf where Miss Susan kept a whip. If the baby woke up and began to cry, Miss Susan reached for the whip. Harriet was whipped so often she had scars on her neck for the rest of her life. One day, Harriet ran away. But she did not know how to get home. Oh, years later, she told what happened.
One morning, Miss Susan had the baby. I was standing by the table waiting till I was to take it. Now, near me was a bowl full of sugar lumps. I never had anything good, and that sugar right by me did look so nice, and my mistress' back was turned to me, so I just reached out to the bowl to take one lump, and she turned and saw me. The next minute she had that whip down. I gave one jump out the door. I ran and ran. By and by, I came to a great pig pen. I tumbled over the fence and fell on the ground, and there I stayed from Friday till the next Tuesday, fighting with those little pigs for the potato peelings. By Tuesday, I was so starved, I knew I had to go back to my mistress. I didn't have nowhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming.
By now, Harriet was very weak and couldn't do much work. So Miss Susan took her back to her master and told him she hadn't been worth 6 pennies. Harriet was growing up. By the time she was 11 years old, she was very strong. She worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields. She worked as hard as a man. Oh, but she was happier than she had ever been. She loved being out of doors. Out of doors, she felt almost free. Free. Harriet thought of freedom all the time. At night, many slaves came to Harriet's cabin. They talked in whispers. They sang softly of the states up north and of a land called Canada. Men could be free up north, they said. One night, Harriet asked,
"How do you get there?"
By underground railroad.
Is there really a train that runs up under the ground?
No, we call it underground because it's a secret. There are special secret roads and paths that lead north. There are people who hide runaway slaves and help them on their way. They are called station masters. Their houses are called stations.
Harriet listened. Her eyes had a faraway look.
The Underground Railroad has conductors, too. The conductors are people who come secretly to the South. They lead groups of slaves to freedom. They lead them north, always following the North Star.
From the door of her cabin, Harriet could see the bright star shining like a beam of hope in the night sky. Follow the North Star to freedom. Oh, someday she would. One evening, when Harriet was 13, she was working in a field, and nearby stood the overseer. It was his job to see that the slaves did their work well. Oh, if they didn't, he used the long whip he always carried. While she worked, Harriet kept looking at one of the slaves. Something was wrong. He wasn't doing much work. Suddenly, he began to run across the cornfield. The overseer shouted at him to come back, but the slave kept running, and the overseer ran after him. Oh, Harriet knew there would be trouble. She followed the men to the village store. The overseer wanted to whip the slave right there in the store. He saw Harriet, and he told her to hold the slave while he tied him up and whipped him. But Harriet shook her head no. At that moment, the slave ran out the door. Quickly, Harriet stood in the doorway to stop the overseer from running after him. The overseer picked up a heavy iron weight. He threw it at the slave. But the iron struck Harriet's head instead. For months, Harriet's family did not know whether she would live or die. When Harriet was well enough to work again, she was sent to a new master, a builder. The builder could hardly believe what he saw. Harriet was shorter than most women. Oh, but she was stronger than most men. She cut more wood in a day than any other slave. Well, the builder was not the only one to admire Harriet's strength. Workers in the field looked at her in wonder. One of them was John Tubman. He was a black, but he was not a slave like the others. His mother and father had been freed by their master before John was born, so he had never been a slave. When he worked, he was paid for the job, and he was allowed to keep all the money he made. Harriet had never known a man like John, tall and laughing and free. Soon after they met, they were married. Oh, now Harriet was happy, except for one thing. More than ever, she wanted to live in freedom. Surely, she thought, John would want her to be free too. She began to make plans for them to run away. She told the plans to John, but he laughed at her. He said he didn't want to hear her foolish talk about running away. Harriet did not understand. John was free. Didn't he want his wife to be free too? At night, she looked up at the sky, at the bright North Star that would guide her to freedom. And finally, she knew that she would have to go on without John. Well, one day, Harriet learned that she was going to be sold and sent farther south to a cotton plantation. Oh, this was the time to try to escape. She remembered the name of a white woman who had once promised to help her. The woman's home was a station on the Underground Railroad. Harriet decided not to wait another day. Harriet could not say goodbye to anyone, not even her mother and father. An escape had to be secret. So that evening she walked past the slave cabins and she sang,
"When that old chariot comes, I'm gonna leave you. I'm bound for the promised land. Friends, I'm gonna leave you."
Later, after she was gone, her friends and family thought about that song, and they knew that it had been Harriet's goodbye message. They knew that the promised land was the North. All that night, Harriet walked through the woods. She was tired and frightened and hungry. Was she being followed? She listened for the pounding of horses, but the only pounding she heard was her own frightened heart. She listened for the barking of the slave catchers' dogs, but she heard only the blowing leaves. At last, Harriet found the house of the woman who had promised to help her. The woman invited her in and gave her some food, and then she told Harriet how to find the next station on the Underground Railroad. At last, Harriet was traveling north to freedom. By day, Harriet hid. By night, she moved north. One night, she traveled in the bottom of a farmer's wagon under a pile of corn. One night, she crossed a river in a rowboat. It was so dark she could not see the man who rowed the boat. After days and nights of walking and hiding, she finally reached the state of Pennsylvania. Now she was safe. Nobody could make her go back. No one in Pennsylvania was allowed to own slaves. Harriet looked down at her hands to see if she was the same person now that she was free. She felt like she was in heaven. Oh, right then and there, Harriet made a promise to herself.
I'm free. My brothers and my sisters and my folks should be free. I'll make a home in the North, and with the Lord helping me, I'll bring 'em all here.
And Harriet kept her promise. Time and time again, she traveled the Underground Railroad to bring more than 300 slaves to freedom. The rest of this book tells about those exciting adventures. It's called Runaway Slave, and it was written by Anne McGovern. I hope maybe you'll finish the book to learn more about Harriet's life. And when you come back to the attic, we'll learn more about America's past. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. What a dipper is? Yes, of course you do. I bet you've even seen one like this, used at home or in the school lunchroom, maybe to dip soup into a bowl. Here is a dipper made from a gourd. Now, while this is not an old dipper, it does show how the early pioneers and the Indians made dippers from the gourds that they grew. There's another kind of dipper that I can't show you, and yet I'm sure you've seen it. Can you guess the kind of dipper I'm talking about? That's right, it's made of stars. Oh, many's the night we see the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper lighting up the sky. Well, you may wonder why I've done all this talking about dippers, but I think you'll understand when you hear today's story. It's called The Drinking Gourd. Tommy Fuller was sitting in church. He put his right hand in his pocket. There was his apple. He put his left hand in his other pocket. There was his ball of fishing line. His brother whispered to him,
"Quit wiggling. Sit up straight."
The boys had been in church all day long. Mother and Father Dudley were downstairs with Grandmother Dudley and the rest of the grown-ups. All the children sat upstairs in the gallery. The girls were on one side, the boys were on the other. Across the way, Tommy could see his 3 sisters. He took a big bite of his apple. Then he took 3 more bites. He looked out the church window. He could see a flock of geese pecking at the grass. Just then, the minister, Reverend Morris, announced,
"Let us sing hymn 263.
Everyone stood up and sang. Tommy reached for his fishing line. He tied one end around his apple core. Tommy threw the core out the open church window. His brother whispered,
"You'll be sorry."
Out on the grass, 3 geese waddled over to see what the core could be. One goose pecked at it. Then she clamped the apple core tightly in her wide bill. Tommy tugged on his fishing line. The goose rose up into the air. She squawked and fluttered. She would not let go. All the other geese hissed and squawked and cackled too. Oh, they made such a racket that the noise filled the church. And everybody stopped singing. Reverend Morse looked up at the gallery and then down at Tommy's father.
Deacon Fuller, I'm afraid it's Thomas again."
Father stamped up into the gallery.
Thomas Dudley Fuller, turn that thing loose.
Tommy dropped the line, and the goose fluttered to the ground. Father led Tommy out of church.
You march straight home, sir, and go to your room.
Tommy walked along, thinking about spankings. It was dark by the time he reached home. He could see the evening star. He went to the barn to say hello to the horses. Father had named them Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. As Tommy gave them each an apple, he said,
"You don't have to be good in church, do you?"
The horses stamped and snorted. Tommy saw the hay wagon piled high with hay. Oh, he wanted to jump from the hayloft down into all that hay in the wagon. So up he climbed into the loft. He hollered down to the horses,
"Hi, Daniel Webster. Hi, Henry Clay. Look at me."
As Tommy jumped into the hay wagon, 2 hens squawked. Then something in the dim loft made a sound like a baby crying. Tommy called out,
"Who's there?"
Then Tommy climbed back into the loft to see what had made the noise. Again he called,
"Who's there?"
A black man stood up, covered with hay. He had an axe in his hand.
Stop right there. You won't take us alive.
Oh, Tommy was so frightened he fell back into the hay. When the man could see who was there, he said,
"Oh, my goodness, Vinny. It's only a little boy."
And to Tommy, he said,
"We just hiding. We won't hurt you."
"Does Father know you're here? What are you doing in our barn?"
Is Deacon Fuller your daddy?
Tommy nodded.
He hid us here. This is my boy, Little Jeff. I'm Big Jeff. This is my wife, Vinny. And this is my baby, Pearl. We're running away.
Running away?
We up from Carolina. We're going to Canada. We've been following the drinking gourd every step of the way.
The drinking gourd? What's that?
Shoot, boy. You mean you've never heard of the drinking gourd? I'll show you.
Little Jeff jumped down from the hayloft and ran to the barn door. Up in the sky, the stars shone. Little Jeff pointed to the Big
That's the drinking gourd.
No, that's the Big Dipper.
Same thing. The front end of the drinking gourd points straight up to the North Star. Follow the North Star, you get to Canada. Get to Canada, and you be free.
From the shadows came another voice.
Thomas Dudley Fuller, didn't I tell you to wait in your room?
Father, I found Jeff and Vinny.
I see who you found. You found all my passengers. Don't ask any questions. Help hitch up the horses. We've got to get started.
Tommy and Father sat in the front of the wagon. Jeff and Vinny and little Jeff and baby Pearl were hidden in the hay. They were driving toward the river. Jeff sat up in the hay.
I've been a slave all my life, Tommy, until 2 weeks ago. That was the day I decided we would run away to Canada on the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad?
Little Jeff poked his head up, too.
Shoot, boy. You never heard about that, neither?
You see, Tommy, the Underground Railroad isn't a real railroad with steam engines and tracks and cars. It's a secret group of people who believe slavery is wicked. They live in homes and farms like ours, stretching from here to Canada. Everybody in the group hides people like Jeff and Vinny, helping them get away.
And they got stations on the Underground Railroad, like our barn.
And they got conductors.
Like me.
And they got passengers, like us.
They call it underground because it's secret. Every bit of it has to be secret.
You right. We valuable property. My old master lost $2,500 when he lost us, if he lost a penny.
Then I'm sure he'll send some men to try to catch you. So you get back down under that hay.
Nobody's gonna catch me as long as I got my axe.
Then Jeff and little Jeff hid from sight.
Tommy, don't say a word to anybody about what happened tonight. Jeff's a brave man. I'd hate to see a brave man sent back into slavery. Promise?
I promise.
Ooh, horses. This is the end of the line. I have to find the boat now. It's hidden here on the riverbank.
Father walked into the darkness. A whippoorwill called. Then Tommy heard hoofbeats down the road. He saw lanterns bobbing. 4 men on horseback rode up to the wagon and stopped. The men got down from their horses.
Say, young fella, I'm a U.S. Marshal. These are my men. We're gonna search that wagon. We're looking for runaways.
Runaways?
A Negro slave, his wife, and 2 children. There's a reward for them. You wouldn't have them hidden in that wagon, would you, boy?
Tommy's mouth was dry.
You wouldn't find anything but hay in this wagon.
Maybe we'd better search it anyway.
Tommy was scared. He thought about little Jeff and the others hidden in the hay. If the marshal found them, he would send them back down south. They would have to be slaves. They would never be free.
Marshal, I guess I better tell you all about it. You see, I'm Tommy Fuller, and I'm running away myself.
You Deacon Fuller's boy?
That's right.
Shaw, this is the boy that made all that fuss in church this afternoon. Fishing for geese.
All the men laughed.
Father was boiling mad. He was going to give me a licking, so I ran away.
We're chasing the wrong wagon, boys. Tommy, you better go home to your pa and take your licking.
Yes, sir.
And next time you go fishing, tell your pa I want you to catch me 2 ducks and a nice fat turkey. That's an order.
All the men laughed. Then they rode away. Father came out of the shadows. Jeff and Vinny sat up in the hay. Jeff's axe was still in his hand.
Tommy, you did just fine.
I thought that marshal would find us sure enough this time.
Tommy was too scared to speak. They walked to the boat. Little Jeff jumped into the boat. Big Jeff helped Vinny and baby Pearl get settled. Then Father started to push the boat away from the shore. Tommy whispered,
"Goodbye, little Jeff."
"Goodbye." Father rode into the darkness, and the boat was gone. It was late when Tommy got home. Everyone was asleep but Mother. She fixed Tommy some supper, and he told her everything that had happened. Then he went up to bed. But Tommy stayed awake, waiting for his father to get home. At last, he heard the front door slam, and Father came up to his room.
Tommy, I believe in obeying the law. But you and I broke the law tonight. The law says we were wrong to help Jeff and Vinny get away.
I know, Father. But can't you change that law?
I've been trying. We've been trying for years and years. Someday it will be changed. But right now the law says Jeff and Vinny are another man's property. Property same as a horse or cow or property worth $2,500.
But Jeff and Vinny are people.
Yes, that's why I can't obey that law. That's why I hate it. It's wrong.
Then Deacon Fuller kissed his son goodnight and closed the door. Tommy lay in bed thinking about little Jeff and the others. To himself he whispered,
If they just get to Canada, they can be free.
Out of his window, Tommy could see the bright North Star, and pointing up to it in the dark night sky sparkled the drinking gourd. And that was the story of the drinking gourd by F.N. Mongeau. Some of the homes that were used as stations on the Underground Railroad can still be seen today. Here is one near the Ohio River. Oh, slaves would stop at places like this to eat and rest before going on to follow the drinking gourd. Will you remember today's story the next time you see the Big Dipper or the North Star? I hope so. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. Today, we're going to look at some things I found that do not come from a happy time in the history of our country. Here is a soldier's cap and the jacket to his uniform. Here is the saber that same soldier might have used. Oh. And here is his belt with a pouch for holding bullets. All these things were used or worn during what is known as the Civil War. Now, our country was not fighting another country in that war. Instead, because not all Americans thought alike or believed that everybody in the country had the same rights, Americans who lived in the north of our country were fighting fellow Americans who lived in the south. Oh, it was a bad time. And not just for the soldiers. Oh, their families suffered as well. I think we'll find that out in today's story. It's about a young boy whose mother had made him a uniform just like his father's. As Martin Emery walked slowly up the lane, he kept saying to himself,
"Flour and sugar and butter and eggs. Flour and sugar and butter and eggs."
Martin had heard his mother whispering these words again and again these past few days. Oh, she needed so many things for Martin and his 3 little sisters. When Father had been at the fort nearby, he saw to it that Mother had these things. But he was gone, and he would be gone for a long time. Martin felt he must somehow take his father's place and help. After all, he wore a uniform now just like his father's. Martin looked up the road. It was Saturday, and time for Snowden and Nellie to appear. Soon, Martin heard the bell on Nellie's neck. He heard the creaking wheels of Nellie's cart. Then he saw the cart piled high with vegetables. He saw Snowden, but Snowden didn't see Martin. Snowden was frowning and looking at a paper and mumbling.
I sure gotta make a lot of money today. I sure got to. There's flour to get for Rose Bell, and sugar, and butter, and eggs.
But if Snowden didn't see Martin, Nellie did. Nellie stopped still, and Martin climbed up on the seat. Snowden blinked with surprise.
"May I go to Washington with you, Snowden?"
Does your mother know?
"She knows. That's why she let me wear my new suit."
Snowden looked at Martin. He saw the soldier-like cap and the shiny buttons.
Nice, Martin. Just like your father's.
Father's regiment brought Mother the cloth and the buttons.
As the cart moved on toward Washington, Martin asked,
"When the war is over, will my father come home, Snowden?"
All the war prisoners will come home then, Martin. All those that the Northern Army has taken will go back south to their homes. And all those that the Southern Army has taken will go back to their homes.
I wish the war was over now.
So do I. Abraham Lincoln does too, I reckon.
Martin knew who Abraham Lincoln was. His picture was in their house. He never could decide which picture he liked better, that of his father or of Abraham Lincoln. His mother said they were both very important people. She had told Martin that Mr. Lincoln was the best president the country had ever had, and his father was the best cobbler. Nellie thumped across the bridge that led from Alexandria into Washington, D.C. Martin kicked his feet back to feel whether the empty basket was under the seat. It was. Oh, Martin knew what would happen to that basket. When they came to the first house, Snowden began to call.
Squash, beans, and taters, garden fresh, garden fresh. Beans, squash, and taters.
After every sale, Snowden would put a scoop of beans or taters, or maybe a big squash, into the basket under the seat. When everything else was sold, that basket would be quite full. Then, when they went home, Snowden would tell Martin's mother that he had some leftovers in the basket, that she could help him out by using them. Had it not been for Snowden's leftovers, Martin knew that he and his family would be hungry more often than they were. Oh, now if they just had sugar and butter and flour and eggs, Martin sighed. Snowden had been watching Martin. Now he said,
Wars which put fathers in prison when they are needed at home are a bad thing.
Martin nodded. He swallowed the lump in his throat and called,
Squash and beans and taters, garden fresh, Beans and squash and taters.
Martin's voice didn't sound very cheerful, and by the end of the morning it began trailing after Snowden's like a small echo. It was a very hot day. Snowden decided that he would leave Martin in a cool spot while he went off to buy Rosebell's groceries. So, when they came to a big park-like place, Snowden called,
"Whoa, Nellie. Martin, you just stay here and rest until Nellie and I come back. It's a good place for anyone in a uniform like yours. There's been lots of soldiers on this line, I can tell you. I've seen them sleeping here, and I've seen them jump up and stand proud and straight when Abraham Lincoln came along."
Abraham Lincoln came along here?
Of course, Martin. See that building there? That's the Capitol building.
Martin stood on the ground and stared. Snowden and Nellie started to leave, and then Snowden remembered something.
I almost forgot. Rosebell gave me a sandwich for you, Martin, and an apple.
I have a sandwich.
Martin did not take his sandwich out of his pocket, for he did not want Snowden to see how small and thin the sandwich was.
You'd better take this. Rosebell made it special.
Thank you.
Martin thought he would take just a bite or two from the sandwich and save the rest for his sisters. He sat on a park bench. He ate his thin sandwich. He ate a little of Snowden's thick one. Then he wrapped it back up in its paper and laid it on the bench. When he wasn't looking, a squirrel slipped onto the bench and grabbed at the sandwich. It fell and landed in a puddle. Oh, Martin could have cried, but he didn't. He would save all of the apple, he decided. He would not take even one bite. The sun was hot. Martin went over and sat down on the cool stone steps of the Capitol building. Then, as always when he was alone, Martin began thinking about his father. The lump in his throat began to grow. He heard someone coming down the steps behind him. Martin watched as a long shadow moved over the step. Then the shadow stopped still. A voice just in back of Martin said,
"Well, well, how's my little soldier?"
When his father's friends said that, Martin always did as his father had taught him, jumped to his feet and saluted. So he sprang to his feet now. As his fingers touched his little blue cap, Martin's heart began to thud like a drum. Abraham Lincoln was standing there. Abraham Lincoln himself.
"What is your name, soldier?"
Martin Emery, sir.
"Where were you born, Martin?"
"In Vermont, in a log cabin."
"I was born in a log cabin, too."
"I know. Mother told me. She said someday I might get to be a president like you."
All mothers say that, Martin. What does your father say?
"I don't know. You see, he's away. He used to be a cobbler, but now he's your soldier."
"What's his regiment, and where is he now?"
The lump in Martin's throat was growing worse. It was difficult to answer.
The 1st Vermont."
Then the sobs came.
"He's in Andersonville prison."
In another moment, the man had taken Martin's place on the steps and was holding Martin folded into his lap, holding the little boy whose sobbing had been so long kept back. When Martin grew quieter, the man began to talk.
"Vermont is a long way off. Tell me, how do you happen to be here, Martin?"
"Father went to war. He was stationed at a fort near Alexandria. So, after a time, he found a house near the fort and sent for Mother and me and the girls. At first, we saw Father often. Then one night, when some of the soldiers were sent out to take a railroad bridge, Father was captured. He was sent to prison."
"And how does your mother manage to take care of you?"
"Well, folks help. The soldiers, Father's friends, bring their washing and their mending to her. They pay her as much as they can. The soldiers give us cloth for our clothes, too. And Snowden helps. Snowden's my friend. He sells vegetables. Snowden fills a basket under the seat with vegetables and calls them leftovers. He gives the basket to Mother, but the vegetables aren't leftovers. Not really.
It seems to me, Martin, that part of this job of helping belongs to the Army. I will speak to somebody, and I'm pretty sure there will be food from the Army stores every week for your mother. Things that Snowden and the soldiers can't supply, like butter and eggs and other things.
There wasn't any lump in Martin's throat now. He felt wonderful. Abraham Lincoln raised himself to his feet. Then, suddenly, a deep frown grew between his eyes.
It's my shoe, Martin. There's a nail sticking right into my foot, and I keep forgetting to have it fixed.
I can help you. Wait.
Martin darted off to find some stones. When he came back, Lincoln sat there on the step with his shoe off. Martin slipped one stone inside the great shoe. With the other, he pounded hard on the sole.
My father showed me how. He's a good cobbler.
I'd like to be a cobbler myself, Martin. A good cobbler.
Martin heard Nellie's bell coming down the street. Oh, but he finished the shoe and gave it to Abraham Lincoln. The great man stood up and set his foot down carefully. Then he pressed harder. Oh, there was no frown between Lincoln's eyes now.
It's a good job, Martin. It feels just fine. You have helped me, Martin, more than you know.
Martin said nothing. He only slipped his hand inside Abraham Lincoln's. They were waiting on the steps when Snowden and Nellie arrived. Snowden's mouth popped wide open and he swept off his hat. Lincoln lifted his hat in return. Then Abraham Lincoln put Martin on the seat beside Snowden and said,
"Goodbye, soldier."
Martin saluted, and Nellie started toward home. And that was Martin and Abraham Lincoln by Catherine Coblentz. I think I'm glad I didn't live during Civil War days. How about you? See you again real soon here in the attic? I hope so. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.